Uh, Earlier this week, I was watching an Indian comedian. He was doing some crowd work. And it was a show here in the United States. And he asks this married couple in the audience how they met. And when they say arranged marriage, the comedian explodes with joy. And he starts bouncing around the stage and pumping his fists, and he celebrates, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And then he stops, he looks around at the rest of the mostly Indian audience and asks them, why aren't you celebrating as well? So, they start clapping a little bit, and he shuts him down and says, no, it's too late. And he asks the crowd, why they have let America brainwash them into believing that arranged marriages are ancient and barbaric. And then he goes on to mock Americans who always ask him and other Indians the same question about arranged marriages. How could you ever marry someone that you don't know? How could I marry someone I don't know, he says. He turns it around. How could you get to know someone and still choose to marry them? There is so much going on in this comedian's bit. But there are two things I want us to notice. First, the pressure to conform to the crowd. Right? His audience isn't just tempted by the American view of marriage anymore. No, they have fully adapted to it, and he calls them out as his people. But the second thing to notice is the comedian's true delight in his own culture's custom. Like, he is practically giddy at finding an arranged marriage in America. I think we have a hard enough time even imagining being giddy about arranged marriage. And here this man had such delight. This comedian captures the spirit of our passage this morning. And if you don't know why, just stay with me for a few minutes. Psalm 1 introduces us to a single person standing against the powerful forces of a crowd. Have you ever experienced the just raw power of a crowd? I want you to just right now, think of a time when you saw a crowd's power to influence people. Can you think of a time where you've witnessed it? Okay, would you help me out real quick? Would all of you just stand up for a second? So, I just had a face shaking at me. I will not. Some of you just stood up because you were asked to politely by me. And some of you just stood up because everyone else did. And some of you didn't stand up. Maybe because you knew what I was doing, or because you're stubborn. I've heard it both ways. Okay, you can all sit down. Here's the thing. We are communal people. God made us for community, to be responsive to the community, to one another. God wired us to go along with others. This is a good part of God's design. It's actually the most natural thing in the world. So that, when we gather on Sunday morning for worship, right, we are following a crowd. Millions of people over 2,000 years have gathered to worship Jesus on Sunday mornings, right? We are part of a massive crowd that every week gets together just like this. And then, right, we get here And we do things like read responsively, and we do it together. And we sing songs together with one voice. And sometimes we close our eyes at the same time, and we stand and we sit as one, and we open our Bibles together, right? There is a lot of crowd activity happening. And it's not that, all of us are super excited about each and every part of our worship time, but we join together. We move together as one because something happens to us when we move together as a crowd, because God seems to use the crowd for our good. Psalm 1 calls this the congregation of the righteous. It's a crowd. It's an assembly. It's a gathering, right? The gathering of those who are in or at least seeking to be in right relationship with each other and with God. And one of the signs that we're in right relationship with each other is that we are in sync and we move together. Psalm 1 pictures this community standing before God, right, together as one. The crowd has become the people gathered around God and his Son, and they stand in his presence. But the psalm tells us the wicked and the sinners will not stand. So Jen, who didn't stand, joke's on you. Hey! Everyone needs a group. A crowd. So, right, I say all this to say that a crowd isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Sometimes a crowd is just a crowd. And it's actually our job to discern, with the help of the Holy Spirit, with the guidance of God's instructions, to figure out whether the crowd is heading toward life or the crowd is heading toward death. So it's actually not a matter of will we follow the crowd. The question is which crowd will we go with? There are these videos on YouTube where pranksters will try to use the power of a crowd to influence people's behavior. Not for bad, but just for laughs, right? There are all different kinds of these videos, but elevator pranks are some of my favorite for some reason. Someone gets on an elevator where everybody is facing backwards. And you just watch how long it takes the person to suddenly, turn backwards, on the elevator. Or like the people get on, when somebody gets onto the elevator, everybody's facing forward, and then like mid-ride, everybody is already planned, they just turn around. And then the person is like, and they follow the group. So I actually just saw this like in real time a couple weeks ago. I ran in a race in Dublin, and everyone was lined up at the starting line. And we were just a few minutes away from the start time, and the race staff were inflating the arch that everybody was gonna run through, and they were setting up the clock, and we were just waiting a couple minutes away, and without warning, there were these 3 motorcycle cops off to the left. One of them just kind of takes off, and instantly, 5 runners just follow. And immediately, the crowd started to go. And there was nobody with a microphone anywhere around, and you could hear people asking, "Are we going? Are we going?" And then you could hear others saying, "They're going, they're going, they're going." And there were still others who were saying, "We're not going, we're not going." But all anybody heard was going, 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 going. And so everybody just went. And the crowd begins to like pick up steam, and they trample the arch that wasn't fully inflated yet, and they just continue to push past the start line. And there were maybe 4 of us who had been close to the very beginning, who had access. Like, we were right next to the guy with the clock. And he looked at us and goes, "It has not started." And we're like, "Okay." And so we're just standing there. And we keep trying to tell people. But as we stood in place, everyone just kept flowing past. I would make eye contact with people who were coming, right? And I would say, "The race hasn't started." And they would look at me, and they would look at the crowd as they're moving and just be like, "Mwah," and just kept going. And at one point, as everybody was going, I thought, should I just go too? I mean, I was legitimately tempted. Like, I had this thought, like, am I going to miss the race? But the race hadn't started. But everybody appeared to be racing. I could see the actual timekeeper, and he was looking at me, and he was shaking his head no. But this crowd was electric. And it was murmuring, "Going, we're going, going." And I wanted to go. I was ready to race. The power of that crowd was so strong. I really had to just stay locked on this timekeeper and go, he's the one who actually knows. Psalm 1 describes the crowd that we shouldn't follow with 3 different words: the wicked, sinners, and scoffers. 3 distinct groups, but all part of the crowd that we should avoid. In the newsletter this week, I sent out the Bible Project's video that's a video commentary on Psalm 1. And I won't repeat everything there because you could just go watch it. But Tim Mackey gives this really helpful definition of each of these 3 groups. And so the first is the wicked. The wicked are those who are morally backwards. So morally backwards, they call evil good and they call good evil. In a way, it's the crowd at my race, right? The race had not started yet, but there were people announcing it had started, and the crowd was moving forward because of their twisted understanding of the current reality. The wicked call evil good and good evil. And then there are the sinners. To sin is to literally miss the mark, and the mark is love. And so sinners are those who fail to love God and love neighbors. The pranksters who like to mess with people in elevators and film them and get laughs on the internet by making people look foolish, right, aren't very loving. I admitted that the elevator videos are some of my favorite. I'm admitting that far too often I find myself standing in the way of sinners. In my preparation for this morning, I started to ask myself this question, and maybe you find it helpful. Where do others tempt me to be unloving to my neighbors? And I realized that I really enjoy way too much laughing at people who are pranked in ways that make them look foolish. And that might seem like harmless fun, but just yesterday, I found myself at lunch, laughing along with a table full of people who were mocking the wicked. Everyone at the table, including me, shared a particular conviction about a current cultural issue. We would all have agreed, this is good, this is bad. And we started talking about those who in our culture have really flipped the script, saying the opposite is true. No, this is good, and this is bad. And if you think you know what the issue is, I can guarantee you now you probably don't. But some people at the table went on to start insulting and mocking those who have gone along with this flipping of the script flipping. You just laughed at me. You're a terrible person. Just kidding. But I laughed. As this table, right, made fools of these people. And I laughed as they talked about this group in ways that were disrespectful and at moments dehumanizing. And so there's this moment where I'm like, I've resisted the counsel of the wicked. I know what is good and I know what is bad, but my laughter put me right in the way of sinners, made me one. Sinners are those who fail to love God and fail to love their neighbors. And I did not love my neighbors yesterday in that conversation. Finally, there are scoffers. And Mackie tells us that scoffers are those who cannot appreciate goodness and beauty anymore. They are jaded. And so all they can do is show contempt for anything that's not like them. As I've been thinking about the scoffer, I think of the Americans that my Indian comedian called out, right? Those who just reject arranged marriage as outdated and barbaric. I can't wait for word to spread that Discovery Church is the church in Livermore that promotes arranged marriage. I have been trying to persuade my daughter that arranged marriages are worthy of our consideration. Listen, I'm not saying that arranged marriages are best or anything like that, but right, can we just acknowledge that there's a certain arrogance to us, looking at the rest of the world throughout most of history and saying, we've found a better way. Not only are we arrogant, we're also a little ignorant. The Bible tells us our hearts are deceitful above all things. Yet we seem to have no problem totally trusting our feelings when it comes to committing ourselves to someone else for the rest of our lives. There is no procedure for finding a spouse that is perfect or foolproof. But we can't even see how deeply formed we've been by our movies and our books and our crowd, so that when we hear of an alternative way of finding a spouse, we just go, that's crazy. A scoffer can't look at a different culture or process and see any of God's wisdom or goodness or beauty in it. A friend of mine died recently. And his death has had me thinking a lot about our relationship. And it was a funny relationship. He was intrigued by Jesus and open to Jesus. And I think that my life made him curious often because he looked at me and I was mostly normal and like him in a lot of ways, but then so different, right, in so many other ways. And he would ask me for advice sometimes. And I would give him instructions straight from the Bible. I wouldn't tell him they were from the Bible. I would just say, what if you, and then I'd give him a suggestion. And then he would laugh every time. My suggestions never made sense to him. He so caught up in the patterns of our world and our culture that the practices of the kingdom of God just didn't sound interesting, appealing, intriguing to him at all. They just sounded weird and unnecessarily hard and different. And he liked to make fun of my suggestions, which I understood. It made sense for him. A guy whose life was not, obsessed with Jesus and obsessed with God's instructions, going, you know what, none of this really makes that much sense to me. It seems kind of silly. The weirder place if we're honest, is when Christians scoff at Jesus' teachings. Right? Have you ever noticed this in yourself or in your discussions with others about the Bible? How many times have we heard each other dismiss, downplay, soften, reject, resist Jesus' teachings, saying stuff like, they're just so hard, or just sounds so weird. They don't make sense to us. How often do we notice, like, we're reading Jesus' teachings and we don't actually have a sense of their goodness or beauty? And so we end up settling for a way that leads to death because we don't actually trust that Jesus' words lead to life. And so we settle for a life that is empty and that is easily blown away. This brings us to our passage's promise of blessing, the promise of a blessed life. And so I have 3 questions that you can take with you for you to consider, right? How do we resist redefining good and evil with the whims of our culture? Because this is always happening in every time and place. How do we resist the temptation to be unloving toward God and our neighbors? The temptation is always there. And the justifications for it are rampant. And then how do we resist the temptation to scoff at God's good and beautiful way? Psalm 1 gives us the answer to all 3 of these questions. And it's so much easier said than done, right? The answer is simple. We are to delight in God's instructions. We are to delight in God's instructions. Like the Indian comedian delights in an arranged marriage. His joy and, yeah, that's the way it is. It's awesome. That sense, like there is a delight in God's instructions, knowing that there is something good in them. I mean, this comedian's delight was so apparent. Like not just in his own response, but actually it became really apparent in the crowd's reaction who got real quiet. Ugh. And I asked this question for us. Do you delight in God's instruction? Like if someone just followed you around for a week, just watched you. I get it, it's creepy. But just, go with me. They're watching you in a non-creepy way. What would they see? Would they see you delight in God's instruction? Or if someone listened to you talk about God's instruction, like what would they hear from you? I can tell you some things I don't delight in. Playing the piano. Sorry, Karen. Learning another language. Sorry, everyone who speaks other languages. Cooking, fixing anything, playing video games. Like the list could go on and on. There's a really easy explanation for why I don't delight in these things. I've never put in the work to get good at any of them. So I'm not good at any of those things. I try to play the piano every now and then. Terrible at it. I try to learn a new language every now and then. Sometimes I even go back to the same one I've started before. I've kind of just given up being good at video games, so I've abandoned that. Cooking, I keep thinking maybe I will one day try that. But I've never put in the work. And let me offer this, and you tell me if you agree with it or not. I think it's nearly impossible to delight in something you don't have any proficiency in. Until you can enjoy a thing with the simple ease of familiarity, delight will be really hard to find. And I think that there are way too many Christians who just don't know God's instructions well enough, who don't know God well enough to delight in his instructions. And that's why they often just seem so hard or weird or strange, rather than such an obvious expression of his loving character, his goodness, and his beauty. There's another obstacle to delight, though. And you know the saying, familiarity breeds contempt. So you can become so familiar with something that you settle into your proficiency, right? You just stop growing. You stop exploring. You stop asking questions. You stop learning new things. You stop being surprised. Jane and I went out for our 19th wedding anniversary on Tuesday night, and there were real moments of delight. For me, I can't speak for her. This week, I've thought a lot about how my delight in Jane comes and goes with my willingness to keep pressing in, with my willingness to stay open to her and who she is now rather than who she was 19 years ago, and letting her continue to surprise me. God's instructions, God, the one who gives those instructions, are a lot like an arranged marriage. We didn't choose them. God chose us. And so, like an arranged marriage, it might take years of effort before the first moments of delight. I know this is true from my experience with the Bible. It took years of reading and rereading before I had the kind of understanding that let me delight in God's words. But then, like in any marriage, time and familiarity can lull us into thinking that we've got our spouse all figured out, that we've got God's instructions all figured out, and so we can grow bored and disinterested. And that's where Psalm 1 is a fresh invitation to us to delight. Will you delight in God and his words? Will you delight in his word, the one to whom these words are pointing? Jesus, his son, who gave his life for us.